All right, well, welcome everybody. You've tuned into the Sci Cafe. And Paul, if you want to turn on your camera, we'll introduce you. This is the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve's monthly Sci Cafe virtual series. And it's a platform to share information about the science that's being conducted in Apalachicola Bay in an informal, casual setting, bringing together residents and scientists to explore different topics. Our program will be about an hour in length with time for questions. Alicia Bruno is our producer, and she'll be helping us with questions. You can put your questions in the question box or raise your hand when we get toward the after the presentation. Today we welcome Dr. Paul Thurman. He is a certified senior ecologist with the Northwest Florida Water Management District. And he is going to tell us about data collection efforts and preliminary results to better understand the potential water flows through the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway and the Gulf County Canal and their effects of nearby water bodies. So welcome, Paul, and we're going to let you take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Anita. Thanks, everybody, for joining me today. Really excited to talk to you guys about a really interesting and I think really unique project we have up here in North Florida, where we're looking at potentially multiple water bodies and potential hydrologic connections between them. So I'm going to turn off my camera so we can get right into it. So I do want to state that this project is ongoing. When we're talking about flow data, we need a lot of data for it. So we're really still kind of in the beginning stages of it. So we're continually collecting more data. And the more data we collect, the better our understanding is. But we do have some good data now, and we're starting to get some really good insights into the system, which I'm excited to share with you guys. Okay, so this project is in collaboration between the Northwest Florida Water Management District and the Department of Environmental Protection. It began back in about 2019 or so due to stakeholder concerns about the health of St. Joe Bay. The information that we were initially receiving as far as the stakeholder concerns was extremely limited. For example, the adverse impacts about the health of the bay that people were concerned about at the time was really undefined. So we weren't really even sure what we were supposed to be looking at. Through subsequent conversations, we learned that one of their primary concerns was reduced water clarity associated with St. Joe Bay, which they were attributing to tannic water flowing into St. Joe Bay via the Gulf County Canal and the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway. So if we look at the two figures that we have here, we see on the bottom left, we have a nice clear blue water, like everybody likes to see. And in contrast, here on the right, we have some different conditions. Even though the water is still pretty clear, we can see that it's largely tannic colored, and we get that tea, color to it. Now, it was also assumed by some of these stakeholders that reduced water clarity was equivalent to poor water quality. And that's not necessarily the case. There are many cases where tannic water is very good and very healthy. However, as we were looking at this, we realized that we had virtually no information related to both observed or potential freshwater inflows into the bay. And it turns out that a lot of the limited data that we had was ultimately shown to be inconclusive or even misleading in there. Compared to what we've actually are seeing so far. So the focus of this study is St. Joe Bay. St. Joe Bay is located in Gulf County. It's approximately 42,500 acres in surface area, and it's a relatively deep bay with an average depth of about 21 feet. Now, unlike a lot of other bays, there's relatively few natural surface water inputs into the bay. However, while there's not many natural inputs into the bay, we do have the Gulf County Canal, which is a man-made water conveyance, which has the potential to transport large volumes of water. This Gulf County Canal is connecting St. Joe Bay near the mouth of the bay, not the base of the bay, like it is in a lot of other systems. So what this means is that fresh water may not necessarily have to flow throughout the entire bay. We also see that the bay has, at least at times, a rather unique salinity pattern, where we'll see higher salinity waters in the southern portions of the bay, and we'll actually have lower salinity water or fresher water up near the mouth of the bay, closest to the Gulf of Mexico. Also, within the near the study area, we have Apalachicola Bay down to the southeast and St. Andrew Bay up to the northwest. All three of these bays here, St. Andrew Bay, St. Joseph Bay, and Apalachicola Bay, are currently connected via the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway and the Gulf County Canal. So these waterways have created an extensive inland hydrologic connection among the bays. These inland connections were initially constructed to provide a safe commercial navigation route for commercial vessels, which was protected from adverse weather conditions out in the Gulf of Mexico. Construction of both of these waterways began sometime around 1938, it looks like. However, when they were initially constructed, they were much smaller in size than they are today. The systems were subsequently expanded and improved several times throughout their history, but have been in their current form for about the last 60 years or so. So currently, they're somewhere between 250 to 300 feet wide on average and go up to about 12 feet in depth, although there is quite a bit of variation in both width and depth throughout the system, depending on where you are. The Gulf Intracoastal Waterway extends from Brownsville, Texas, all the way to Appalachia Bay. However, within our study area, we're really only concerned with about 33 miles of it. And we have the Gulf County Canal right around the middle of it. So from the Gulf County Canal, we have about 17 miles to the Apalachicola River and 16 miles to St. Andrew Bay. The Gulf County Canal has a similar cross-sectional dimensions. However, it's considerably shorter, only about 5 miles long. And the Gulf County Canal connects the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway near White City to St. Joe Bay at Port St. Joe. So this project started back in 2019 in cooperation with the Department of Environmental Protection. And it started off as an effort to understand flows in the area. So we started off by looking at 3 different areas for discharge stations. 2 of these stations were designed to measure flows into and out of the Gulf County Canal through the Intracoastal Waterway. And the 3rd station was this IWW Jackson River station, which was designed to get flows in the Intracoastal Waterway closer to the Apalachicola River. It turned out that Jackson River station, the area was a nightmare to monitor. At that location, there was a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation and a really long shelf where we were able to put the station before you got into deep water. So what that meant is that we couldn't get really good velocity measurements there. And because we couldn't get good velocity measurements, we weren't able to get accurate discharge data there. So we discontinued collecting discharge data at that station. We're still collecting water quality data. But for the discharge data that I'm talking about today, I'm only going to be talking about the IWW West station and the IWW East station. Okay, so these 2 stations, IWW West and IWW East, are located on either side of the Gulf County Canal, and they were put here so we could use a mass balance approach to figure out how much water was going into the Gulf County Canal. So what we have is flows at the IWW East station are measuring flows that are going from the direction of Apalachicola River and Lake Wimico towards the Gulf County Canal in St. Andrew Bay. The IWW West station is measuring flows going from the direction of the Gulf County Canal and Lake Wimico towards St. Andrew Bay. And the difference between those represents flows that are going into the Gulf County Canal. And once those flows go into the Gulf County Canal, they can go towards St. Joe Bay and potentially make it all the way down there. Now, before I go into any of the data specifics, I want to talk about a few qualifiers with respect to this discharge data that impacts the conclusions we can draw at this time. First, all of this discharge data, for the most part, remains preliminary or provisional and is subject to change following QA/QC procedures by the USGS. Now, in conversations with the USGS, we do feel that this data is in pretty good condition, so we don't anticipate any large changes. But when they do that, there almost certainly will be some sort of changes. So as I'm talking about discharge volumes at these different stations, don't focus on the absolute number that I'm doing there. Think of them in relation to each other. Again, as I said, we're continually collecting data. Anytime we add data to this, those numbers change. So they're not absolute. And it's kind of a moving target we can think of. Similarly, all the data that I'm talking about today extends from the initial data collection through November 2022. At one of the stations, we had new equipment installed after November. And as a result, there's currently an unquantified amount of error associated with that when we collect and convert the velocity data into the discharge data. That data will be cleaned up and that error will be identified, but at this point, we don't know what that is. So we wanted to compare apples to apples. So we cut off everything at November 22, but ultimately that data will be available in the near future. Something else to point out is this entire area is extremely tidal and fluctuates considerably due to tides. What this does is this makes flows extremely messy and noisy at times. So we did a couple things to make it a little bit easier to look at. First, we tidally filtered the data, which smooths out the data and gets rid of those daily tidal signals. Second, we converted that data into daily averages. And if we look at the two figures on the bottom left here, we can see what that did. So that really smoothed out the data. On the bottom left, we have the continuous data. Once we tidally filtered and converted it to daily averages, we got to the data on the right, and now you can really see the long-term changes in the flows and how they move through time. And the last thing I want to talk about, and this is really important here, the flows that I'm talking about only represent flows at the location where they were measured. So at this time, we're not making any assumptions about where that data is or where that water is coming from. So for example, flows at the IWW East station, we're not saying that that water is coming from the Apalachicola River, Lake Wimico, or Apalachicola Bay at the time. All we're saying is this is how much water is flowing by that place. We don't have a real good understanding right now how much is surface water, how much groundwater pickup or losses we're getting in the area, or anything like that. So again, all we're talking about, how much water is flowing by a given point. Okay, so what are we seeing? So we're going to start off with the IWW East station, which is measuring flows going from the direction of Lake Wimico towards the Gulf County Canal and towards the Intracoastal Waterway near St. Andrew Bay, excuse me. And we have almost 600 observations of daily average flow. During this time period, the average flow is over 3,000 cubic feet per second. These flows throughout that time period are highly variable, and they range between less than negative 2,000 cubic feet per second to almost 9,000 cubic feet per second. The negative flows that we're talking here are flows that are actually going towards Lake Wimico from the direction of the Gulf County Canal and St. Andrew Bay. And if we look at the data here on the bottom left, we see that the majority of the time flows are actually moving towards the Gulf County Canal and towards St. Andrew Bay. But there are a few periods here in late 2022 where we saw the flows move in the other direction. We also saw that flows in this area were, and actually throughout the entire study area, are highly stratified at times, meaning that the water at the surface is comprised of different components in the water at depth. And they're also behaving very differently at times. So usually we see saltier water on the bottom with fresh water floating on the top. And at times the fresh water might be flowing one direction and the salt water was flowing the complete opposite direction. So what this means is you can't just look at what's happening on the surface and think you have an understanding of the entire water column. So it's really complicated and can get really complex. Now, if we move towards the west, now we're looking at the Intracoastal Waterway west of the Gulf County Canal station. So these are flows moving from Gulf County Canal and the IWW East station towards St. Andrew Bay. We have almost 700 observations of daily flow, during which time the average is almost 900 cubic feet per second. Again, flows were highly variable, ranging from negative 1,850 CFS, which is water going from the direction of St. Andrew Bay to the southeast towards Gulf County Canal and the other stations, to positive 3,350 CFS, which is water moving from Gulf County Canal towards St. Andrew Bay. Again, if we look at the long-term time series that we have here, we see that, again, the majority of the time, water is flowing to the northwest or towards St. Andrew Bay. However, we do see several periods where water is actually flowing the opposite direction from the same direction of St. Andrew Bay towards the Gulf County Canal and towards the IWW East station. Now, when we look at these two stations together and we actually take the difference between them, now we're looking at water that's flowing into the Gulf County Canal and towards St. Joe Bay and potentially all the way to the bay. Here we have almost 500 observations of daily average flow. The average during this time period is over 2,000 cubic feet per second. Again, highly variable, ranging from negative 430 CFS to over 5,000 CFS. At this station, if we look at the long-term time series, what we see is that water was almost always discharging into the Gulf County Canal, with the exception of one very short period in late 2022, where water from that Gulf County Canal was moving into the Intracoastal Waterway. It looks like at that time that was associated with a tropical event, so some really different weather conditions, which can kind of throw everything haywire, where we get salt water moving up into Lake Wimico and things like that, storm surge, basically. So to summarize what we know so far, the Intracoastal Waterway and the Gulf County Canal appear to provide a pathway for fairly and potentially large volumes of water to travel towards St. Joe Bay and towards St. Andrew Bay. However, we do still have some relatively large questions associated with that. We don't know whether this water is enough to really significantly affect the bays, and we don't know whether that water is making it all the way to the bay. So those are still two really big questions we have. Now, if these volumes of water are making it all the way into the bays, it looks like these could potentially be the largest sources of freshwater input, largest single sources of freshwater input into both St. Joe Bay and St. Andrew Bay. So that's really interesting. The most obvious thing we found is how complex the hydrology is, and how much the flows really vary. So the extent and the directions of flows is determined by a complex series of ever-changing water levels due to things like tides, river flows, winds, climate, weather, anything like that. So remember, water always flows downhill. So anything that's going to affect water levels at one location in relation to another is going to affect the flows moving between those two locations. I also wanted to point out that the flow numbers that I'm putting on this figure here don't exactly add up. Now I'm using different periods of record for each one of those, so we're not exactly comparing the same thing, but they're pretty close in there. And we know these numbers will change, but we think the broad conclusions we can draw from it are pretty solid at this time. So moving forward, we're planning on continuing to collect the discharge data to monitor these flows, analyze the data, and ultimately we're going to follow the science. So we want to make sure we're getting it right and that we're asking the right questions. We don't want to rush to any conclusions or make any broad assumptions. We don't want to think we know what a solution is until we have all the data to fully understand the question that we're asking, and we can make the most informed decision that we can. We're also looking to hold stakeholder meetings to discuss the results of this effort with the stakeholders, in addition to talk to them about what are they seeing out there, what are their observations, how have they seen the bay change through time, what are their concerns about the bay. These stakeholders are often on the front line of the bay, and they can provide some really important insights into the system. So what we're hoping is that by talking to them, they can help us identify some of the significant data gaps, and also, what are the things that we should be looking at the bay that maybe we're not aware of right now. We would then like to take all of this data and develop a broader monitoring plan for the bay, which is going to outline the direction for future research, and lays out not only the major questions that we want to identify in the bay, but how are we going to get those answers? How long do we think it's going to take? What are the methods that we think is most appropriate for those? So we now know a lot more than we did when we started this project, but we still have some pretty significant remaining questions that we're trying to pin down. So for example, have there been any recent changes in the bay? Okay. And if we are seeing these changes and they're happening recently, why are they happening now? So these canals have been there for quite a long time. During most of this time, the bay ecosystem appears to have been relatively healthy. So why are any changes happening now and not 30, 50, or even 80 years ago? These changes that we're seeing, are they related to freshwater inflows? We know that freshwater is essential for estuaries and bays. And if you change how much water is flowing in there, whether you're increasing it or decreasing it, you're going to affect the organisms that's there. They have to have that fresh water. We don't know these flows that are moving into the Gulf County Canal. Have they changed through time? We don't know that. We're trying to get a good handle on that. And the answers to these questions will help determine where the future research and resources go to help better manage the system. So we do have a few more focused questions that we're looking to get answers on. First, as I alluded to earlier, what are the sources of fresh water that we're measuring at these stations? What is that water comprised of? How much of it is surface water? How much of it comes from groundwater? Are we getting gains or losses throughout the Intracoastal Waterway? Is water coming all the way from the Apalachicola River or Bay? Is it coming from somewhere else in there? Again, we don't know just yet, but we're trying to get at that. That's one of our next steps that we're going to be looking at. We also need to know what happens at extremely high and low flows, especially different weather and climate conditions. We have some evidence right now to indicate that when water levels are low, the water behaves very differently than when it's high. So we need to get those extremes, periods of drought, periods of flood, things like that. We also need to better understand the fate of water flowing into St. Joe Bay, where it goes once it flows into the bay, and what's it doing to the bay. So as I said earlier, is that volume of water enough to affect St. Joe Bay? Because it's near the mouth of the bay, does it actually flow back into the bay and circulate, or does it go straight out into the Gulf of Mexico? Again, those are things that we have on the radar to potentially look at. And finally, we don't yet know what this means for Apalachicola Bay or St. Andrew Bay. As I said, right now we're focusing on St. Joe Bay. As we follow the science and see where it goes, and we identify some of these water sources, then we can start thinking a little bit broader about how these systems work together. So with that, I'd like to wrap things up and thank a few people. So this grant that's funding most of this work is funded by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. From the DEP, I'd like to thank the Chief Science Officer, Dr. Mark Raines, Sarah Davis, Christine Morris, Linda Powell, and John Brucker specifically, who have been absolutely fabulous working partners with this and great supporters of the work we're doing here. From the USGS, I'd like to thank Ron Knapp. And from here at the district, I'd like to thank our Executive Director, Lyle Siegler, our Chief of Staff, Caitlin Brongell, in addition to Carlos Hurd and Kathleen Hodes. And with that, I'll wrap it up and address any questions anybody might have.
You're letting people decide what they want to ask. Give it a few minutes. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. A lot of questions answered and a lot more data to be gathered for sure.
Yeah, it's certainly one of those situations where the more data you get, the more questions you have.
Yeah.
Hey, John, your hand's raised. Would you like to come off mute?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Paul, thanks for sharing that information. I do appreciate it. I just had a question concerning the water that's moving towards St. Andrews. You made a very interesting comment how sometimes the fresher surface water moves one direction and the saltier, bottom water moves another direction. With the water moving in regards, from the canal towards St. Andrews, obviously there are less cubic feet per second, but have you guys begun to look at data of which kind of water is mostly moving that way? Is it more fresh water, or is it more of the saline water, or is that still something that you're looking at?
So that's really something that we're still looking at, but to hopefully provide a little bit of insight into that. Because the location is so tidal, we get the salt water coming from the bay flushing in and out. So what we're seeing that net move of fresh water moving through the system. So we think a lot of the salt water is kind of neutral. It's moving in and then it's moving back out. But we haven't gotten at that yet to see if whether any of that salt water is actually making the turn and then going that 17 miles, which is certainly possible.
And then I have a follow-up question too. You mentioned, to figure out what's coming out of the canal. We know, so many cubic, feet go into the canal, but how much of it makes it down and into the bay? Has there been a thought or discussion to put a discharge tower down there closer towards the mouth? I know it gets difficult with the amount of development and the port things that are down there, but has there been any talk to potentially, move an additional tower or build an additional tower, down at that end?
Yeah, so when we first started all this, that was the plan. Before any of these stations were built, that's where we were originally looking to do it. If we want to know how much water is flowing into the bay, let's measure right at the confluence so we know exactly how much is there. We went out there and we did a site visit with the USGS, who we contracted with to actually build these stations for us. They're the experts. And it turns out that Gulf County Canal is about the worst possible place you could want to put a discharge station like that. Down there near the bridge, you have a lot of boat traffic. Boat traffic and constructed stations like that don't play well together. I don't know if you remember, a couple years ago, we had one of our stations completely taken out by a boat. And it was down for a few months until they could get it rebuilt. We also have a lot of people utilizing that area, and these towers are a magnet for vandalism. So that's been a problem at other locations as well. So we originally thought about that, but in talks with the USGS, we figured that where we did it was the best possible place. But getting an idea of any pickups and losses along that Gulf County Canal is certainly something that we want to get a better understanding of.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay, so Gary Lowe has a few questions. First, he wants to know, do you have a project end date for this research?
Not at the moment. Like I said, we're following the data and we're following the science. So we're trying not to frame it too much and, see where it takes us. Certainly, if we answer the questions and we get to the place where we think we understand the system and we're good with that, we will stop it. But at this point, we've got a lot of questions. So we're still looking to continue the date, and it's kind of open-ended at the moment.
Okay, and he also wants to know, are you considering other factors that might impact water quality in St. Joe Bay besides flow? For example, wastewater disposal, population growth, impacts on fisheries, anything like that?
So not really as part of this project at the moment. We have done some water quality data collection at the request of DEP, but that wasn't really part of this broader question that we're looking at here. We're focusing on the flows going into the bay and how those flows may be affecting, say, salinity and water clarity.
Okay, Georgia Ackerman wants to know, is the timeline known with regard to when and how it will be known where the fresh water is coming from? For example, when might we know how much water from the Apalachicola is heading over to the IWW?
I really can't answer that right now. We're just starting to have those conversations and figure out, how would we go about doing that? And we need to secure funding for that too. So that's on our wish list, but nothing has been confirmed just yet.
Okay, moving on, Chadwick Taylor wants to know, what's the timeline for the study of those potential flows from the Apalachicola?
I think that's the same, just like you said, we don't know just yet. Once we get the funding and we can hopefully put together this research plan, we'll have a better idea once we can really flesh out what it would take to answer that question.
Okay. Dan Tasmir wants to know, would looking at the pre-development hydrology before the Intracoastal Canal and White City Canal help provide some understanding of how the current conditions have changed?
Yeah, any data that we have would be valuable. Unfortunately, a lot of that data we can't seem to locate, and it may just not exist. So if somebody has a line on some data that we're not available with, please let me know.
Okay, and another one from Gary Lowe is, do your preliminary observations suggest any future engineer changes to flow regime that might improve water quality in the St. Joe Bay?
We're not that far yet. We're still trying to figure out exactly what has changed and why it's changed. Depending on the answers of that, that could take you in a million different directions.
All right. We are at a halt with the questions. We'll just wait a couple minutes to see if anything else comes through, or if anybody else has a hand up and would like to come off mute. Yeah, John, is that a legacy hand, or do you have another question?
I do have another question, Paul. It's John again. Sorry, I haven't talked to you in a while, so I got just a couple questions, or just another question. We all know that sedimentation coming out of the Gulf County Canal into the bay is, gaining steam in terms of attention, and we all know there is some sedimentation coming out of it. Has there been any discussion to add a sedimentation study, adding sedimentation plates to the flow towers to see just what kind of sediment accumulation or what kind of sediments may be traveling through the ICW and down into the GCC?
There hasn't been any specific plans to measure any of that. We have had those conversations, and we are aware that sedimentation is a concern in the area. So those are, conversations we're going to continue to have.
Great. Yeah, some of that may fall onto me with the aquatic preserve as it dumps out into the bay. So as you guys are having those conversations, please feel free to reach out, because I think that's one of the issues we're noticing more is, as you mentioned previously, sometimes the north end of the bay, especially near the mouth, exhibits a wide range of salinity, surface and bottom, with the water up there. But is it making it into the south end of the bay? But we know we've lost seagrass coverage near the canal and things like that. So, it'd be interesting to really know, is that sediment, originating from somewhere else, or as a lot of us predict, is it really just coming out of the Gulf County Canal itself?
Yeah, let's talk.
Yep, sounds good, man. Actually, I was going to reach out to you before today, but I ran out of time.
Understood. I know how that goes.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, Paul, we thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing more about the data you're receiving. We really appreciate your time, and this webinar has been recorded, so it'll be available on our website. You'll get a notice of that link probably tomorrow for everybody who signed up. And just to let you know, we have our next Sci Cafe is going to be June 22nd, and Tom Doolin is going to talk about fungi. So he's a fun guy. You tune in, and that'll be from 3 to 4. So thank you everybody for attending, and we'll talk to you next time.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paul.